Welcome to History and Ashes. Sometimes history moves with loud speeches and heroic legends, and sometimes it moves with checklists, paperwork, and quiet orders issued in dusty offices. The Six-Day War, also known as the June War or the 1967 Arab-Israeli War, shattered borders and rewrote regional politics in less than a single week. Yet it was shaped by fuel spreadsheets, flight schedules, and nervous commanders trying to interpret incomplete radio reports. Air forces were erased in a single morning. Borders that had existed for decades vanished by the end of the week, and ordinary families woke up in one country and went to sleep in a different one without ever leaving their homes. For all the dramatic images we remember, many of the decisive choices were made in rooms where the clock ticked louder than the men speaking. We cover everything about history on this channel, from forgotten battles to the slow bureaucratic decisions that quietly push nations toward crisis. And this story begins with anxiety layered on top of routine. Patrols along desert borders, dusty supply convoys, meetings that lasted longer than the patience of the people in them. What seems obvious now did not feel inevitable then. Officers argued over maps that did not quite match the terrain. Civilian leaders debated whether the economy could survive another mobilization. Farmers worried about water rights. Soldiers wrote letters home and tucked them into their pockets, unsure whether they would be mailed or discovered later. Before we go deeper, if you could drop into the comments and tell us where you are watching from and what time it is there, that would be wonderful. Consider it our own little global observation post. And, while you are there, please subscribe gently, not like a sudden preemptive strike. Without your support, History and Ashes might disappear faster than an airfield runway under a surprise bombing raid, and none of us want to see this channel die. Thank you now. Back to the slow machinery of history. In the years leading up to 1967, the region lived in a tense routine that was both ordinary and dangerous. Checkpoints went up, patrols rotated, propaganda crackled across radios that people listened to while preparing dinner. Many citizens did not expect a major war. They expected more of the same uneasy stalemate. Israeli communities near borders drilled for civil defense with the dull rhythm of habit. Egyptian officers studied Soviet manuals and compared them with local realities, often finding that the theory looked simpler than the desert. Jordanian and Syrian positions along the front lines were maintained with a mixture of vigilance and exhaustion. Life continued: weddings, school lessons, markets, but with an undercurrent of worry that could not be fully named. The bureaucracy behind mobilization can be strangely anticlimactic. Trucks have to be inspected. Fuel allocation forms need signatures. Radios must be tested and retested. In the spring of 1967, the movement of Egyptian forces into the Sinai Peninsula involved not only dramatic convoys, but also stalled engines, missing spare parts, and soldiers waiting for orders that came hours late. It was not a march of destiny so much as a series of logistical challenges that happened to accumulate in the same direction. Meanwhile, Israeli intelligence tracked these developments with maps pinned to corkboards, photographs spread across tables, and analysts arguing quietly over whether each move meant preparation for defense, deterrence, or attack. Closing the Straits of Tiran, one of the turning points, was not experienced at first as an explosion but as a policy announcement, a diplomatic gamble. Shipping schedules were disrupted. Insurance clerks in distant cities recalculated risk. Diplomats drafted cautious language, trying to buy time. Inside Israeli leadership circles, discussions turned from theoretical war games to urgent scenarios. Could the economy withstand prolonged mobilization? Could the Air Force survive a first strike? There were intense debates, not over glory, but over probability and survival. The sorts of calculations that feel painfully unheroic, yet determine everything. On the ground, the human stories were quieter. Egyptian conscripts slept on thin mattresses in hot tents, trading rumors while waiting for meals. Israeli reservists left jobs and classrooms, filled buses, and found themselves reunited with friends they had last seen during earlier call-ups. In Jordan, soldiers along the West Bank line repaired trenches and worried about whether their equipment, much of it aging, would hold up under pressure. In Syria, commanders inspected positions on the Golan Heights, aware that the rocky terrain gave advantages and vulnerabilities at the same time. People carried on with their duties, often thinking more about immediate discomfort, heat, dust, boredom, than the sweeping historical moment that was forming around them. The regional rhetoric was loud, but many decisions remained strangely procedural. Telephones rang in ministries, messages were misinterpreted, alliances were affirmed in public speeches and questioned in private corridors. Intelligence communities on all sides tried to guess intentions through incomplete data. Was that new deployment a rehearsal or the beginning of something irreversible? Could diplomacy still unwind the situation? Every small misread signal deepened mistrust. When war finally came, it arrived not with a theatrical declaration, but with aircraft lifting off before dawn, guided by carefully rehearsed flight paths. Pilots had memorized radio silence procedures and low-level approaches that depended on timing down to the minute, or, more accurately, down to the heartbeat. Yet even this decisive strike, remembered as bold and sudden, was built on weeks of mundane preparation. Runway photographs studied until they looked ordinary, aircraft maintenance logs checked line by line, weather reports compared, and spare engines positioned at bases just in case. The extraordinary depended on layers of quietly competent work that rarely makes it into the headlines. For civilians, the first day unfolded with disorienting contradiction. Radios carried announcements, mixing certainty with confusion. Some families prepared cellars, others stood on rooftops trying to see distant smoke. Rumors traveled faster than official statements. In border towns, people noticed unfamiliar traffic patterns, ambulances, military convoys, vehicles with blackout headlights. Shops closed earlier than usual. Teachers dismissed classes and sent students home with instructions that felt both routine and ominous. The emotional landscape was not triumph or despair, yet it was uncertainty. The shock of seeing multiple Arab air forces crippled within hours came later, in waves of information that filtered through various channels. Leaders scrambled to make new plans while still absorbing what had just happened. Communications failures magnified the chaos. Reports were delayed, repeated, or contradicted. A commander might hear that a squadron was intact, only to learn minutes later that it had been destroyed on the ground. On the Israeli side, there was astonishment at the apparent success, combined with fear that some hidden counterstrike might still be developing. Nothing felt final. Meanwhile, soldiers in trenches and armored vehicles did not see the big picture. They experienced the conflict as dust clouds, shouted orders, and long moments of waiting punctuated by sudden movement. Water became precious. Sunburns hurt more than the abstract concept of geopolitics. In the Sinai, the desert magnified logistical weaknesses. Stalled trucks blocked narrow tracks, and units lost contact while trying to navigate vast, featureless expanses. In the West Bank, uneven terrain forced careful, often slow advances. On the Golan Heights, rocky slopes tested the patience and nerves of both sides. Survival depended not only on courage, but on practical details, keeping engines running, conserving ammunition, staying hydrated. Diplomats in distant capitals followed the news with a different kind of unease. Each report carried possible international consequences. Could the conflict expand? Would superpowers be drawn directly into the battlefield? Behind formal statements, envoys exchanged cautious messages, exploring ceasefire possibilities even as fighting intensified. The cold, bureaucratic language of telegrams disguised the urgency underneath. How to stop a war that was moving faster than the diplomatic machinery designed to control it. The strange thing about the Six-Day War is how compressed time became. What might normally unfold over months occurred in days, sometimes in hours. Entire military doctrines were tested, shattered, or confirmed within the span of a single sunrise. Yet for many participants, those days felt elongated. Night watches dragged on. Long drives across desert roads seemed endless. Every rumor stretched the imagination. This contrast between swift strategic outcomes and slow personal experience is one of the quiet truths of warfare and one of the reasons this conflict still fascinates historians. Behind the scenes, there were also ethical dilemmas and difficult choices that rarely receive attention. Commanders had to balance the urgency of seizing initiative with the responsibility of minimizing civilian harm. Civilians on all sides faced fear, displacement, and uncertainty about what would come next. Some families hid relatives, others sheltered neighbors, and many simply waited, listening for footsteps and hoping they belonged to friend rather than stranger. These unrecorded acts of resilience and worry form the human background of the more familiar military narrative. By the end of those intense first days, the outlines of a transformed Middle East were beginning to appear, though few could articulate what it would ultimately mean. Territories were changing hands. Political leaders prepared statements that tried to explain the inexplicable. Soldiers looked at newly captured positions and wondered how temporary or permanent they might be. Newspapers prepared headlines while editors searched for words that would not sound outdated by the next morning. Even victory and defeat were not yet fully defined. They were still in motion, like sand shifting in the wind. And beneath it all lay a quieter question. How had so many small administrative decisions, cautious misinterpretations, and routine preparations stacked up into something this vast? History often turns not on a single heroic act, but on a series of necessary, sometimes dull actions performed by people who never imagined they were reshaping the future. As we continue through this story, we will look closely at those overlooked details, the forgotten reports, the hesitant phone calls, the long convoy stops, because they tell us as much about power and survival as the famous battlefield moments. It is worth asking, as we pause here at the early stage of the narrative, if so much depended on everyday procedures and seemingly minor choices, how many other turning points in history might also be hidden inside the ordinary, waiting for us to notice them? In the early hours of the conflict, the story of the skies reveals just how much patient preparation can shape outcomes. Israeli pilots trained repeatedly on low-altitude routes, memorizing landscapes like students cramming before an exam. They flew close enough to the ground that radar screens sometimes missed them entirely, a technique that depended not on heroics, but on discipline. Mechanics worked long shifts beforehand, tightening bolts, replacing worn parts, marking aircraft with maintenance notes that mattered far more than any speech. When the planes finally lifted off that first morning, they did so not as symbols first, but as machines whose reliability had been earned with greasy hands and careful checklists. Across the region, airfields presented another seemingly mundane detail with enormous impact. Many of them kept aircraft parked in predictable rows, convenient for commanders to inspect, but vulnerable if attacked. Runways lacked shelters that could absorb blasts. Some crews were briefed late, and anti-aircraft units were given orders that reflected older expectations rather than the evolving situation outside. The collision between routine procedures and sudden crisis is part of why the initial strikes proved so devastating. War, in this sense, did not reward bravery alone. It rewarded whoever had spent more nights thinking through unglamorous contingencies. Inside Egyptian command headquarters, confusion spread in ways that feel painfully human. A misinterpreted message suggested that an attack might be only partial. Telephones rang without reaching the right officers. Reports came in fragments, a destroyed runway here, a missing squadron there, and it took time to understand the scale. Meanwhile, civilian radio stations maintained regular programming longer than one might expect, because no one wanted to announce the wrong thing prematurely. The gap between reality on the ground and the information available to leaders widened by the hour. Jordan received assurances and warnings that sometimes contradicted each other. Coordination between allies moved through channels shaped by politics as much as military necessity. Maps were shared, but not always updated. When Jordanian forces opened fire along the West Bank front, it was partly out of obligation to broader commitments, and partly from fear that inaction would appear as betrayal. In a sense, the first exchanges of artillery were guided less by precise strategic thinking and more by the momentum of alliances already set in motion. On the Israeli side, what looked afterward like confident strategy was often experienced in real time as cautious improvisation. Officers debated whether to expand ground operations immediately or to hold positions and wait for clearer intelligence. Reserve units had to be fed, housed, and supplied in improvised camps. Civil defense officials tried to reassure towns near borders without promising safety they could not guarantee. Families listened to crackling radios and measured their days by the rhythm of sirens. When armored columns began advancing in the Sinai, they moved along routes that presented simple but profound challenges. Desert tracks could support vehicles as long as they stayed dry and firm, yet one poorly timed bottleneck might halt an entire formation. Fuel trucks had to keep pace. Water distribution became a constant concern. The desert emphasized every logistical flaw. Some Egyptian units retreated not because they lacked courage, but because their communications collapsed and they feared encirclement. Drivers became as important as commanders. A stalled engine could expose dozens of men. Meanwhile, in Gaza and along the West Bank, urban and rural landscapes shaped the fighting differently. Narrow streets slowed vehicles. Civilian neighborhoods forced commanders to hesitate. Children watched columns of soldiers pass through places where only days earlier markets had bustled as usual. The shift from everyday life to armed occupation did not happen with cinematic flourish. It happened through checkpoints established on corners that people had walked past for years, now suddenly rearranged by strangers with lists and orders. The Golan Heights remained quiet, longer than other fronts, but not untouched by anticipation. Syrian positions sat on elevated ground, with fields of fire stretching across valleys. For the soldiers stationed there, the waiting could be worse than combat. They cleaned weapons repeatedly, checked range markers, and attempted to guess whether the war would intensify in their sector or bypass them entirely. Uncertainty became a kind of psychological trench. Beyond battlefields, international observers watched with a mixture of detachment and alarm. In embassies from Washington to Moscow, analysts compiled bulletins. Words like ceasefire, escalation, and provisional control appeared in cables that read like technical manuals for catastrophe management. The language seemed bureaucratic, even dull, but behind it lay deep anxieties. Would one misjudged intervention widen the conflict into something far larger? These documents show how much of global diplomacy operates through careful phrasing rather than dramatic gestures. Inside Israel, Prime Minister Levi Eshkol faced the burden of explaining decisions that had been shaped by fear of annihilation and by the belief that waiting longer would only worsen the situation. His speeches sounded cautious, even hesitant, reflecting his temperament and the depth of responsibility he felt. For some listeners, this tone seemed unsure. For others, it expressed realism. In Egypt, President Gamal Abdel Nasser confronted a different challenge: maintaining public morale while dealing with reports that contradicted earlier expectations. His image as a symbol of Arab unity made every setback more politically costly. Ordinary people processed the war in fragments. In Cairo, families lined up at bakeries, buying extra bread, just in case. In Tel Aviv, blackout curtains were adjusted and radios stayed on through the night. In Amman, residents whispered about troop movements while continuing to run errands. Life did not stop, even under bombardment. It narrowed, slowed, and took on a watchful quality. There is something quietly heroic about how communities sustain routines in the face of uncertainty. Religious sites, particularly in Jerusalem, added yet another layer of complexity. The old city remained both sacred and strategic. For centuries it had experienced sieges, treaties, and uneasy coexistence. Now it once again became the focus of armies and diplomats, each aware not only of military significance but also of symbolic weight. To capture or lose such a place meant more than adjusting a border. It meant shifting narratives deeply embedded in faith and memory. As fighting continued, the pace of events accelerated beyond the ability of many institutions to keep accurate records. Some units later reconstructed their own histories from diaries, unofficial notes, and conversations with survivors. These reconstructions reveal the fragility of historical memory. Even within a single battalion, participants remembered sequences differently. Did the artillery barrage begin before the order to withdraw, or after? Which road was blocked first? Such questions may sound minor, yet they shape how entire nations understand a war. Another overlooked dimension lies in medical services. Field hospitals sprang up quickly, staffed by doctors and nurses who worked through exhaustion. They faced practical dilemmas: triage decisions, shortages of certain supplies, and the constant movement of front lines that sometimes forced them to relocate overnight. Ambulance drivers became navigators of chaos. Many later spoke less about fear and more about fatigue, the kind that seeps into bones when sleep is repeatedly postponed for the sake of others. Refugees also became part of the story, often without clear documentation. Families fled villages not always because they were forced at gunpoint, but because rumors spread faster than facts. A neighbor heard that a nearby town had emptied. People debated whether to stay or go, weighing livestock, elderly relatives, and the hope that the situation might stabilize. Some left and returned, others never did. These movements created new realities that would shape politics long after the gunfire ended. Meanwhile, Israeli commanders realized that quick victories on the ground created strategic puzzles. Should captured territories be held temporarily as bargaining chips or integrated more permanently? The answers were not obvious at the time. Each option carried risks: diplomatic isolation, new security responsibilities, moral and legal debates. These early uncertainties foreshadowed decades of negotiation and conflict that would follow. On the Arab side, leaders confronted the painful task of explaining losses that seemed disproportionate to expectations. Many analyses later pointed to structural problems: inadequate coordination, over-centralized decision-making, misaligned training. These critiques can sound dry, but they point to important truths about institutions and how they respond under stress. In war, a poorly written directive or a delayed message can do more damage than an enemy shell. What stands out, looking closely, is how many individuals tried to do their jobs diligently within systems that were already stretched. An officer forwarding an urgent dispatch, a mechanic staying late to service another vehicle, a nurse improvising bandages. These small acts rarely receive attention in grand narratives, yet they are the threads from which history is woven. Survival, for both soldiers and civilians, depended on these steady, quiet efforts. By the middle of the week, momentum tilted decisively, but the future remained unclear. Would outside powers impose a halt? Would new fronts suddenly ignite? Could territorial gains be consolidated, or would counterattacks reverse them? Each command post had its own version of these questions, reflected in maps covered with markers that shifted slightly hour by hour. The war felt both fast and fragile, and so, stepping back from the smoke and dust, one sees not simply a story of victory and defeat, but a landscape shaped by procedures, habits, miscalculations, and resilience. Beneath every headline lies a logbook, a fuel manifest, a misunderstood directive, and a human being doing their best to interpret rapidly changing circumstances. It leaves us with a quiet puzzle. If this many outcomes depended on ordinary systems under pressure, how different might events have been had just a few of those systems functioned or failed in another way? As the conflict unfolded on land, the Sinai Desert became a vast laboratory for understanding how armies survive when everything familiar disappears into heat and sand. Tanks that looked powerful in parades struggled with dust-clogging filters. Drivers learned to keep slight distance between vehicles to avoid choking visibility. Commanders relied on compasses and hastily marked maps, often uncertain whether the next ridge concealed an enemy position or simply more empty terrain. The desert rewarded patience and punished haste. Some Israeli columns advanced cautiously, stopping frequently to check bearings. Others, pressed by opportunity, pushed forward more rapidly and risked losing cohesion. In this strange mixture of careful planning and intuitive judgment, the war acquired its distinctive rhythm: bursts of movement, followed by stretches of tense, almost boring recalibration. Egyptian units, scattered by disrupted communication, attempted to regroup along defensive lines that looked clear on paper but proved difficult to hold. Retreat routes became congested as vehicles converged on the same roads. Bridges that were supposed to serve as lifelines turned into bottlenecks. Commanders faced impossible choices. Should they hold positions with limited information, or pull back to avoid being trapped? Many chose withdrawal, hoping to re-establish order farther west. Yet each retreat created more confusion, as rumors of encirclement spread faster than official orders. Soldiers described seeing columns of vehicles stretching across the horizon, all moving in the same direction, driven by fear of being cut off rather than by coordinated strategy. In these moments, survival depended less on ideology than on simple skills: keeping engines cool, rationing water, sharing fuel between vehicles when supply trucks failed to arrive. Some units abandoned equipment they could not maintain. Others improvised, cannibalizing parts from damaged machines. These decisions were not dramatic, but they shaped outcomes. An armored company that managed to keep its engines running could fight another engagement. One that stalled became simply a group of men on foot, exposed to heat and attack. The desert turned war into a contest of mechanical endurance as much as military doctrine. On the Israeli side, commanders faced the unexpected challenge of rapid success. Each breakthrough created new territory to secure, new roads to patrol, and new logistical lines to extend. Victory did not feel like celebration. It felt like paperwork multiplied by geography. Fuel depots had to be relocated. Supply points were improvised in areas where there had been none. Engineers marked minefields and cleared paths with methodical slowness. Military police organized traffic to prevent friendly units from colliding in the expanding theater of operations. This administrative side of warfare rarely appears in popular memory, yet it was crucial to sustaining momentum. Meanwhile, the West Bank experienced a different tempo. Urban centers, villages, and agricultural fields formed a mosaic of communities now caught between shifting armies. Israeli forces advanced through terrain that required close coordination between infantry and armor. Jordanian defenders, familiar with the landscape, attempted to delay them with well-placed positions and artillery fire. Civilians took shelter in basements, courtyards, and mosques, listening for changes in the sound of gunfire that might signal either danger or relief. Some families prepared small bundles of belongings, ready to flee if necessary, while others stood by their homes, determined not to abandon land that had shaped their lives for generations. In Jerusalem, history seemed to pile on top of itself. The modern city, with its administrative buildings and bus routes, overlapped with ancient walls and sacred pathways. Commanders on all sides understood that every movement there carried symbolic weight far beyond tactical utility. Even the decision to fire or not fire on particular locations required layers of consultation. Religious authorities worried about damage to holy sites. Political leaders feared international reaction. Soldiers navigated narrow streets where centuries of memory pressed close on either side. For them, war became a strange combination of reverence and danger. The Golan Heights still hovered on the edge of wider involvement. Syrian artillery periodically shelled Israeli communities below, shaking daily life with abrupt explosions. Farmers tended fields under the shadow of potential escalation. Children learned to move quickly toward shelters when sirens sounded. The routine of living under threat created a stoic resilience, a habit of adaptation that would shape how people later remembered these days. When one lives with uncertainty long enough, even fear becomes structured, almost procedural. Beyond the Middle East, governments calculated their responses. In Washington, officials debated how to balance alliance commitments with the need to avoid direct confrontation with the Soviet Union. In Moscow, leaders weighed support for Arab states against the risk of appearing to lose influence. These deliberations filled conference rooms with maps, ashtrays, and the smell of strong coffee. Statements issued to the public emphasized restraint, while internal memos revealed a constant tension. How to influence events without stepping into the conflict themselves. The global Cold War lens filtered every decision, turning regional battles into episodes within a much larger strategic contest. At the United Nations, delegates delivered speeches that sounded formal, measured, and at times repetitive. Draft resolutions circulated, then were revised, then circulated again. Diplomats argued over wording. Should terms like withdrawal, occupation, or security guarantees be used, and in what order? These debates could appear tedious, yet they carried immense significance. A single phrase could shape negotiations for decades. The slow pace of diplomacy contrasted sharply with the rapid pace of fighting, exposing a persistent dilemma. Institutions designed for deliberation struggle when history accelerates. Throughout the war, letters and diaries preserved quieter perspectives. An Israeli reservist might write about missing a wedding he had planned to attend, noting the strange mixture of regret and duty. An Egyptian conscript might describe waiting for orders that never came, feeling both relief and shame at not having engaged the enemy. A Jordanian officer could record frustration at shortages and pride in the stubborn defense of a particular position. These personal accounts avoid grand narratives. They dwell instead on heat, hunger, fatigue, and the effort to maintain dignity amid confusion. They remind us that history is experienced not as sweeping analysis, but as a series of long days and restless nights. Medical teams continued their relentless work. Surgeons performed operations with minimal sleep, improvising when supplies ran low. Nurses soothed frightened patients while listening to distant artillery. Some hospitals treated soldiers and civilians side by side, separated only by curtains. Decisions about who received attention first were guided by triage principles that felt deeply humane and painfully impersonal at the same time. The ethics of care under pressure formed another dimension of the conflict, largely invisible to those reading headlines. The refugee crisis expanded as more families chose movement over uncertainty. Some traveled by foot across rough terrain, carrying children and elderly relatives. Others used carts, cars, or whatever transportation they could find. Border crossings became focal points of fear and negotiation. Officials had to decide who could pass and under what conditions. Relief organizations attempted to provide food, water, and shelter, though they too struggled with incomplete information. For many displaced people, the immediate concern was not politics, but simply where to sleep that night and how to find the next meal. Those makeshift decisions would later harden into long-term realities. Israeli society confronted another layer of complexity as newly controlled territories brought new populations under its authority. Administrators were assigned tasks they had never anticipated, issuing permits, managing curfews, setting up communication lines with local leaders. Some viewed these duties pragmatically as temporary necessities. Others began to see strategic or ideological opportunities. The ambiguity of these early administrative measures set patterns that would shape the region long after the guns fell silent. Arab leaders met to reassess strategy, sometimes in tense gatherings, where blame, frustration, and solidarity mixed uneasily. Reports from the front lines painted a picture that was both alarming and incomplete. Plans were revised repeatedly. Appeals were made for international intervention. In public, statements emphasized resolve. In private, the mood was more somber, as the scale of losses became harder to deny. Yet even amid disappointment, there was determination to rebuild, to learn from mistakes, and to preserve a sense of collective dignity. Religious and cultural responses added further layers. Clerics offered prayers for protection and for the dead. Community leaders organized food distribution and encouraged mutual aid. In some neighborhoods, neighbors shared generators or pooled scarce fuel. These acts of solidarity did not change the course of battles, but they preserved social cohesion. They also demonstrated how resilience often emerges not from heroic speeches, but from ordinary people helping one another survive difficult days. By the later stages of the conflict, momentum seemed to lean decisively toward Israel, yet uncertainty remained. Commanders wondered whether an unexpected counteroffensive might still appear. Civilians continued to prepare for air raids, even when they grew less frequent. Diplomats pressed harder for ceasefire arrangements, worried that each passing hour might complicate future negotiations. The sense of living inside a compressed history persisted, as though the region had been placed on fast forward while the world watched, half fascinated and half afraid. Looking back, historians often debate which moment constituted the true turning point. Was it the early destruction of air forces, the collapse of certain defensive lines, the diplomatic missteps that limited options before the fighting even began? Each interpretation emphasizes different causes and lessons. What becomes clear, however, is that no single explanation suffices. Economic constraints, political ambitions, institutional weaknesses, and human judgments all combined in ways that could not easily be predicted. As we close this section, the Middle East stands on the brink of a new reality, one that few participants fully grasp. Territories have shifted, populations have moved, and alliances have been tested. Yet many questions remain suspended in the air like dust after a convoy passes. What will permanent control look like? How will displaced families rebuild their lives? And perhaps most importantly, how will societies remember these days as tragedy, triumph, warning, or something more complicated that defies simple labels? As the fighting continued, the geography of the conflict began to reveal how profoundly terrain shapes strategy. not in dramatic strokes, but in the small, stubborn details that frustrate planners. In the Sinai, long stretches of road meant convoys had to travel in predictable lines. In the West Bank, hills and villages created sightlines that shifted unpredictably from one bend to the next. Commanders on all sides frequently discovered that maps simplified realities that were anything but simple. A narrow wadi might look insignificant on paper, yet it could stop a column for hours. A patch of soft sand could swallow a vehicle that had appeared unstoppable only moments before. This mismatch between expectations and reality became a recurring theme, quietly steering decisions as surely as any formal order. Jerusalem, meanwhile, evolved from a tense standoff into a focal point that demanded delicate handling. Israeli forces approached with caution, aware that every street corner carried centuries of meaning. Jordanian defenders, entrenched in fortified positions, fought with determination grounded in both duty and pride. Civilians tried to navigate daily needs while staying out of contested areas. Shopkeepers closed shutters. Families clustered in interior rooms. Religious leaders worried aloud about shrines, manuscripts, and artifacts. It was not simply a battle for a city. It was an encounter with history itself, layered and fragile. Even commanders who prided themselves on pragmatism felt the weight of decisions made within sight of ancient walls. The process of urban fighting unfolded more quietly than popular imagination suggests. There were bursts of gunfire, yes, but also long intervals of cautious movement, where soldiers advanced room by room, doorway by doorway. Engineers cut through barriers. Medics carried stretchers across courtyards. Radio operators listened to static-laced instructions that arrived a second too late or lacked crucial detail. The ordinary frustrations of communication took on heightened urgency, and everyone involved understood that a single misjudgment could damage not just property, but memory itself. Elsewhere, in the Sinai, the retreat of Egyptian forces turned increasingly chaotic. Rigid command structures, which worked adequately during peace, proved brittle under rapid pressure. Orders required signatures, clearances, and verification that could not keep pace with the changing battlefield. Officers who tried to improvise sometimes found themselves out of sync with neighboring units. Bridges became saturated with vehicles, some damaged, others simply stalled. In the desert heat, tempers frayed, and decisions were made in minutes that would later be analyzed for decades. Those caught in the stream of withdrawal often described it not as fear of the enemy, but as fear of being swallowed by disorder. Israeli units advancing through that environment faced their own anxieties. Victory did not erase uncertainty. Mines remained hidden beneath sand. Unexploded ordnance littered crossroads. There were constant reminders that each meter gained carried risk. Commanders emphasized procedures, dismounting to check suspicious patches, spacing vehicles correctly, enforcing rest cycles despite the temptation to press on. What looked like relentless forward motion was actually a delicate balance between momentum and caution. On the Jordanian front, the story included moments of stubborn defense that received less attention in textbooks. Small outposts held out longer than anticipated. Artillery units, operating with limited ammunition, carefully calculated every shell. Communication officers spliced wires, repaired damaged equipment, and searched for workable frequencies while shells landed not far away. Their work seldom appears in dramatic retellings, yet without it, nothing else functions. If history is a chain, these were the quiet links holding it together, at least for a while. The broader political picture remained fluid. Cairo broadcast statements meant to bolster morale, focusing on resilience and unity. Tel Aviv issued announcements emphasizing security and the necessity of defensive measures. Amman spoke of steadfastness and sacrifice. Listeners, however, sensed gaps between rhetoric and rumor. Relatives called one another across sometimes unreliable telephone lines, piecing together their own patchwork understanding of events. Public communication became a form of morale management as much as information sharing. In kibbutzim and towns inside Israel, civilians continued routines with a strange combination of discipline and resignation. People lined up at communal dining halls, discussed crops and supply deliveries, and then returned to shelters when sirens wailed. The ordinary persisted, even as extraordinary circumstances hovered overhead. On the Arab side, similar blends of normalcy and disruption occurred. Families prepared meals with rationed ingredients, organized watch shifts, and shared radios among neighbors. These quiet continuities reveal the deeper story. Societies learn to live with uncertainty through ritual and habit. Internationally, pressure mounted for a ceasefire, but drafting one required language precise enough to satisfy deeply mistrustful parties. In conference rooms, translators compared versions of phrases in different languages to ensure no hidden ambiguities. Legal advisors debated whether a single verb implied obligation or recommendation. Such debates might appear maddeningly tedious to outsiders, yet they shaped the framework within which future negotiations would occur. Even in moments of crisis, bureaucracy persists. And in diplomacy, bureaucracy is often the battlefield. The involvement of religious institutions added moral layers to an already complex picture. Some clerics urged restraint and compassion, reminding listeners that sacred places deserved protection above patriotic fervor. Others framed the conflict in terms of destiny and spiritual duty. These divergent messages mirrored the broader tensions within communities, between caution and passion, practicality and symbolism. Faith became both a source of comfort and a lens through which events were interpreted, often in incompatible ways. Medical services continued to show the quiet heroism that often escapes sweeping histories. Supplies that looked sufficient on paper dwindled quickly. Generators failed at inconvenient moments. Doctors adapted surgical procedures to makeshift conditions. Volunteers carried water, managed patient lists, and scrubbed floors. Few of them thought of themselves as shaping history, yet their labor preserved lives that would influence families, neighborhoods, and eventually, politics. Survival, at every level, depended on chains of care, rarely acknowledged in grand narratives. As Israeli troops approached key positions in Jerusalem, negotiations began over how to handle sacred compounds and civilian neighborhoods. Some plans proposed buffer areas, others suggested joint administrative arrangements. Most were improvised in real time, developed under pressure with incomplete information. The resulting compromises would echo far beyond the end of the fighting, influencing debates that continue to this day. It is one of the ironies of history that temporary arrangements often harden into long-term structures simply because no one finds a better alternative in time. In the north, Syrian artillery continued its intermittent shelling, creating a constant background of tension without immediately escalating into full-scale engagement. For Israeli communities below, the disruption blended into daily life, forming a rhythm of shelter drills and repairs. Children drew crayon pictures that combined ordinary scenes with distant explosions, a visual reminder that even youth adapted to the blurred boundaries between peace and conflict. Farmers debated whether to plant or postpone. Livestock had to be fed either way. The land itself refused to wait for geopolitics to settle. Amid these developments, intelligence analysts on all sides struggled to interpret the shifting landscape. A convoy sighted on a road might be reinforcement, retreat, or simple resupply. Radio silence could signify discipline or disaster. Analysts compared fragments of data, argued over probabilities, and produced reports filled with cautious language. They were expected to produce certainty out of ambiguity, a task that rarely satisfied political leaders eager for clarity. These frustrations illustrate how often war operates under the fog of imperfect information, despite modern technology. As days passed, the psychological pressures accumulated. Soldiers spoke of fatigue that dulled emotions. Civilians reported dreams filled with sirens and dust. Commanders overanalyzed small incidents, searching for patterns that might not exist. The human mind, confronted with rapid change, tries to impose order. Sometimes it succeeds. Sometimes it invents misleading narratives. These internal battles, though invisible, shaped how decisions were made and later remembered. A small but revealing aspect of the conflict involved supply chains for seemingly trivial items. Spare batteries, replacement boots, medical gloves, canned food. When shipments arrived on time, operations appeared smooth. When they did not, frustration flared. Logistics officers found themselves improvising routes, borrowing trucks, and negotiating priorities with frontline commanders who understandably believed their needs were urgent. Every army discovers that wars are partly won or lost in warehouses and transport depots. Refugee flows grew more complicated. Some people moved temporarily and expected to return within days. Others crossed borders with the painful realization that departure might be permanent. Aid workers recorded names on lists, assigned tents or temporary housing, and tried to establish routines to avoid chaos. Children created games out of debris, while adults debated whether to stay together as extended families or disperse in search of work. These decisions, made under pressure, would ripple across generations, reshaping communities and identities. By now, the outlines of a transformed map were becoming visible, but interpretation remained unsettled. Israeli leaders saw newfound depth in strategic defense, but also understood that larger territories meant heavier administrative burdens and international scrutiny. Arab leaders confronted losses that generated both introspection and renewed calls for unity. In coffee houses, classrooms, and barracks, people argued quietly about what had gone wrong and what might happen next. Blame and explanation circulated side by side, neither fully satisfying. In Jerusalem, when the fighting there subsided, scenes of mingled awe and unease emerged. Soldiers walked through areas they had only read about in scripture or history lessons. Civilians ventured out cautiously, measuring the new reality street by street. Religious leaders negotiated access and control with a seriousness that felt almost ceremonial. The city exhaled, but it was not a sigh of resolution. It was the breath drawn before a long conversation that was only beginning. Diplomatic efforts intensified, drawing more firmly on international legal frameworks and precedent. Words like status, occupation, and security assurances began appearing in analyses and speeches. Committees met. Legal scholars drafted memoranda. These processes might seem detached from the emotions of the battlefield, yet they represented attempts to translate violence into policy, to turn the chaos of war into something that could be debated across conference tables. The transition was imperfect, but necessary. Looking across the region at this moment in the narrative, what becomes striking is how different timelines overlapped. For soldiers, events moved by the hour. For civilians, they moved by the day. For diplomats, they unfolded by the statement and resolution. And for historians, they would later be compressed into tidy paragraphs. Yet none of these perspectives fully captured the lived uncertainty. That uncertainty is where many of the most important human experiences reside. By the end of this phase, the fighting was narrowing in focus, even as its consequences widened in scope. People asked themselves what borders would look like, how daily life would adjust, and whether the new realities were temporary or permanent. Leaders drafted speeches to frame outcomes in ways that preserved legitimacy. Journalists prepared retrospectives even while events still unfolded. The world watched and speculated, guessing at patterns that had not yet stabilized. And so we pause again, in a moment where the dust has not quite settled and the meaning of each movement remains unfinished. The maps are changing, the people are adjusting, and the institutions are scrambling to catch up. The question that lingers is deceptively simple. When history shifts this quickly, who truly understands what has been set in motion and who will only realize it years later? When the consequences have already taken root, the war that would come to be called short, decisive, and almost mechanical was, beneath that tidy label, something far more fragile. By the middle of the confrontation, soldiers and civilians alike were learning that history rarely moves at the same speed as headlines. Official bulletins spoke of rapid advances, captured airfields, and shifting borders. But on the ground, people were still lining up for bread, still arguing at bus stops, still worrying about broken radios and missing relatives. The day-to-day did not pause just because generals were making decisions that might redraw the map. In the baking dust of the Sinai Peninsula, Israeli troops moved forward with a mixture of training, improvisation, and a quiet fear of running out of water. Water discipline became a ritual. Sip, never gulp, wet the lips, and wait. Share carefully, even grudgingly. Some vehicles carried extra canisters lashed down with rope, and mechanics checked engines with the dull patience of people who knew that overheating could matter as much as enemy fire. The desert rewarded the meticulous. A misplaced bolt or a clogged fuel line could strand an entire unit, And stranded soldiers were not heroic symbols, they were simply tired people in the sun. Egyptian conscripts, many of them young and far from home, practiced similar rituals in reverse. Retreat was chaotic, but life inside that disorder had its own routines. Men boiled tea when they could, clung to familiar gestures, and swapped rumors about what had gone wrong. Some spoke about earlier years, about the confidence following the nationalization of the canal, about the speeches that promised dignity and strength. Now they found themselves walking along roads scored with tank tracks, listening to aircraft they could not see, and wondering whether orders would arrive, or whether they were already forgotten. Behind the front, clerks and quartermasters processed endless paper, requests for spare parts, lists of casualties, tallies of ammunition. These were the kinds of boring details that rarely enter popular memory but quietly define outcomes. A unit that received the right carburetor at the right time might move again. A shipment that went missing might strand a column at the worst moment. In retrospect, people speak of brilliant maneuvers. In practice, someone had to sign a line on a form, and someone else had to load a crate. In Jerusalem, daily life unfolded under tension that felt both ordinary and unreal. Shopkeepers opened when they could, carefully stacking produce in narrow stalls. Families listened to radio broadcasts in shared courtyards, the wires stretched like fragile threads of certainty. Some residents stocked water in old bottles. Others gathered blankets near the door in case they had to rush to a shelter. And still, laundry hung from balconies. Cats slipped between stone alleys. The city continued, because cities rarely have the luxury of stopping. The battle for the city was as much about symbols as about streets. Soldiers walked past sacred sites that had collected centuries of prayer and dispute. Ancient stones carried layers of memory, and those layers pressed silently upon everyone present, whether they wanted them or not. Commanders weighed tactical maps, while also calculating what it would mean politically, spiritually, diplomatically, to alter the status of holy places watched by the entire world. On the Jordanian side, observers peered through binoculars, trying to make sense of smoke patterns and vehicle movements. Many of them were not career soldiers. They had civilian professions interrupted by mobilization. They wrote notes on scrap paper and passed messages through radios that crackled with static. Their families waited in towns where normal chores took on a strange gravity. Parents reminded children to fetch water, sweep floors, and feed animals, even as rumors flowed faster than the Jordan River itself. Diplomats, far from the dust and gunfire, spent long hours in offices filled with stale coffee and cigarette smoke. They drafted cables in careful language that disguised uncertainty. Every phrase had to carry meaning without closing doors. Should one say cease fire or suspension of hostilities? Should one mention borders explicitly or leave them deliberately vague? These choices seemed technical, almost dull, yet they shaped how future negotiations could even begin, setting boundaries for arguments that would last decades. Pilots lived another rhythm entirely. Missions lasted minutes, preparation lasted hours, and nerves lasted much longer. Ground crews checked every hose and panel with the meticulous patience of people who understood that precision kept their comrades alive. Pilots studied maps until the roads and wadis seemed like old acquaintances. Many later remembered not the adrenaline of takeoff, but the anxious quiet before it, the slow breathing, the checklist, the sudden awareness of how fragile a machine actually was. Civilians across the region practiced informal survival strategies passed down through families. Keep extra bread. Know which neighbor has a radio. Hide important papers in something ordinary. In Egyptian towns, families discussed whether to send children to relatives farther south. In Israeli kibbutzim, residents rehearsed where to shelter animals and how to ration milk if shipments stopped. In Palestinian neighborhoods, people debated which streets might be safest and which rumors were likely false. Survival was rarely heroic. It was practical, repetitive, and quietly exhausting. Internationally, newspapers printed striking headlines, but many of the reporters faced the same limitation: fragmentary information. They pieced together stories from official briefings, whispered accounts, and glimpses through restricted vantage points. Readers thousands of miles away formed strong opinions based on incomplete maps and brief paragraphs, never seeing the long lines at bakeries or the men cleaning sand from rifle bolts by lamplight. The speed of the campaign masked the emotional lag. Victories on paper did not instantly translate into understanding on the ground. Families waited days to confirm whether a son or brother was alive. In some homes, the door-knocking sound became something ominous, a carrier of news nobody wanted. Meanwhile, others experienced a quiet euphoria that felt almost guilty relief, mixed with uncertainty about what the new reality might demand. Amid all of this, forgotten figures played crucial roles. A nurse who stayed awake for 2 nights, improvising splints from crate wood. A mechanic who figured out how to keep an aging truck moving using a scavenged hose. A schoolteacher who turned a basement into a makeshift shelter and kept children calm by reading them stories from worn books. None of these people appear in grand strategic analyses, yet their choices stitched communities together during hours when everything else seemed to fray. When historians later analyzed the conflict, they explored ambitious themes: preemptive strikes, deterrence, the balance of air power, the shock to regional politics. But another layer endures beneath those abstractions: the endless lists, quiet repairs, cautious sips of water, and small acts of resilience. The war was not simply a clash of states. It was a series of days lived by ordinary people who woke up, faced uncertainty, and tried to make the next hour survivable. There were also unexpected outcomes already forming, like seeds that would sprout in difficult soil. New territories brought new responsibilities and dilemmas. Lines on maps were not just administrative, they contained homes, fields, holy sites, and memories. Soldiers who had marched with focus and discipline now found themselves guarding checkpoints, interacting daily with civilians whose lives had been abruptly altered. The transition from movement to management created a quieter, more complicated strain. In many ways, the most significant details were the ones that did not feel dramatic at all. A patrol schedule, a supply convoy rerouted along a different road, a weary commander deciding to wait another hour before advancing. Each decision was like a small stone dropped in a still pond, sending ripples outward in directions nobody could fully predict. Later, people would search for turning points. Often, they were hidden among these modest choices, barely noticed at the time. Even now, documents from that period reveal voices that seldom reach the public. A letter from a mother in a rural village asking whether her son's unit had been seen. A memorandum about fuel reserves that reads as dry as sand but was crucial to the next day's operations. A diary entry by a young officer wondering whether any of this would truly make the region safer. These writings remind us that history is not only about what happened, but about what people thought might be happening and what they feared might come next. As the dust of mid-war settled just enough for clearer sight, another realization slowly emerged. The end of fighting, whenever it arrived, would not mean the end of consequences. Borders could shift in days, but the human adjustments would take years. New checkpoints, new travel restrictions, new maps on classroom walls, all of these would seep quietly into everyday existence. The war's brevity would become part of its myth, while its long shadow would become part of daily life. And perhaps that is the unsettling truth at this point in the story. A conflict that unfolded in a matter of days began to reshape decades. Ordinary people navigated it with small acts of endurance, meticulous routines, and hopes folded into pockets like fragile notes. Looking back, one cannot help but wonder, in a world where such large outcomes depend on such ordinary details, which small decisions in those tense days mattered most, and how many of them passed unnoticed at the time. What followed was not the dramatic crescendo many expect from a short, decisive conflict, but instead a slow, deliberate tightening of reality. Armies paused, regrouped, and adjusted to terrain that had overnight acquired new political meanings. Cartographers waited for official instructions, their pencils hovering above maps that suddenly looked provisional. Most people did not experience this as history in motion. They experienced it as waiting for news, for clarity, for someone in authority to say what ordinary life should look like next. Along roads winding through the Sinai, vehicles idled in the heat, while officers argued quietly over routes. Dust collected in soft layers along windshields, and drivers kept engines running longer than they should, wary of shutting them off in case they refused to start again. Simple tasks, like finding enough shade for a briefing or locating a working radio, took on an almost ceremonial importance. The desert rewarded caution, and the units that paused to check every strap and every tire often fared better than those that pushed ahead with impatience. Egyptian soldiers, retreating across wide stretches of sand, faced a different ordeal. They carried heavy packs that cut into their shoulders, and many discovered that boots worn in training blistered badly across long marches. Some removed them altogether and walked in socks until the fabric wore away. Commanders tried to impose order, but roads clogged with abandoned equipment, overheated trucks, and men trying to find water. Stories circulated about units that had become separated and wandered for hours, listening for aircraft and hoping to avoid them. In letters later recovered, some conscripts wrote not about fear or glory but about thirst, the stubborn ache in their calves, and the embarrassment of not knowing where they were supposed to go. In the West Bank, households learned to adapt to a new rhythm of patrols and checkpoints. Farmers rose early, not simply to tend their fields, but to calculate how long it might take to pass through newly established controls. Shopkeepers adjusted their opening hours, keeping ledgers that reflected uncertain supplies and fluctuating prices. Children learned which alleyways were now considered off-limits, tracing alternate paths to school in chalk on the ground. Each adjustment felt small, even mundane, and yet collectively they reshaped daily routines in subtle but enduring ways. Israeli soldiers stationed there faced a different kind of challenge. Many had trained to move quickly, to advance and withdraw, not to manage civilian life. Now they were responsible for ordering traffic, inspecting papers, and calming tense confrontations at crowded gates. Some tried to memorize the faces of locals, believing familiarity might ease suspicion. Others kept notebooks in their pockets, recording questions they did not know how to answer, such as how to handle a family separated by a road that was newly blocked. The war shifted from sudden movement to persistent administration, and that transition brought a quieter strain that is harder to recount in headlines. In Damascus and Tel Aviv, leaders consulted thick folders filled with intelligence reports. Each sheet was dense with details: fuel estimates, artillery placements, the condition of old fortifications along the Golan Heights. Advisors debated what these numbers meant, but even they admitted that confidence was often an illusion. Weather could shift, morale could falter, a misinterpreted message could undo a carefully planned maneuver. The calm tones used in official discussions masked a profound uncertainty about how far the conflict should extend and what could follow if it went further. On the Golan, Syrian villagers gathered belongings with the grim efficiency of people accustomed to sudden orders. Chickens were driven into improvised coops, doors were tied shut with rope, and documents were tucked into cloth bags. Some residents buried family keepsakes beneath olive trees, marking the location with small piles of stones they believed only relatives would recognize. The hills, usually quiet except for the murmur of wind, filled with the sound of hurried footsteps and the muted cries of animals being moved. Long after, those stones would remain, quiet reminders of decisions made in haste. Medical teams across the region confronted shortages that revealed how unglamorous logistics truly are. Sterile gauze dwindled faster than expected. Generators failed at awkward moments, leaving operating rooms in dim backup light. Nurses improvised with whatever they could find: boiled cloth, diluted antiseptic, folded cardboard to stabilize injured limbs. Doctors spoke softly to patients, not because they expected reassurance to change outcomes, but because the tone carried dignity. In many memoirs written years later, it is these small acts, a hand on a shoulder, a cup of water held carefully that surface with surprising clarity. Meanwhile, international diplomats continued their careful dance. In New York and other capitals, envoys reviewed drafts of resolutions in windowless rooms, negotiating commas and adjectives as though they were fragile explosives. The concept of land, security, and recognition had to be expressed in language abstract enough to avoid immediate rejection, yet firm enough to signal intent. Some observers, reading these documents decades later, might dismiss them as bureaucratic, but beneath the formal phrasing lay human anxieties: the fear of humiliation, the desire for stability, the hope, sometimes faint, that a shorter war might not have to become a longer conflict. News correspondents tried to make sense of it all, writing dispatches that alternated between urgency and speculation. They spoke with farmers standing quietly in their fields, with officers who offered careful, scripted comments, and with refugees carrying rolled blankets on their backs. Many journalists admitted, privately, that they felt they were always one step behind events. Censorship, limited access, and the simple chaos of movement meant that every report risked being incomplete. Yet those reports shaped global perception, giving distant readers the impression that they understood a story that was, in truth, still forming. Within Israeli society, a strange mixture of relief and unease began to take root. There were celebrations, yes, but there were also quiet conversations around kitchen tables about what it meant to hold new territories filled with people who had not chosen this outcome. Soldiers returned home with dust still embedded in their uniforms, and parents sometimes found themselves unsure whether to embrace them first or ask unanswerable questions about what they had seen. Rabbis, teachers, and community leaders debated scripture and responsibility, trying to interpret victory in moral language. The tone was not triumphant, so much as contemplative, edged with worry. Palestinians, newly living under occupation, faced the reality of permits, curfews, and uncertain futures. Many families developed unstated strategies for resilience. A relative who kept records of every interaction with authorities, a neighbor who gathered children in the evening to distract them with stories, an older woman who insisted on baking bread each day as if routine itself were a form of defiance. Markets reopened, but conversations grew quieter. People learned to look past soldiers without seeming defiant, to carry documents at all times, and to keep a mental list of safe places to hide if alarms sounded. In Egypt, official statements emphasized resolve and dignity, while privately officials sifted through after-action reports that laid bare miscommunications and structural weaknesses. Some commanders admitted they had never received clear orders during crucial hours. Others described radios that worked only intermittently, leaving units isolated. Civil servants in Cairo drafted memos about rebuilding airfields, retraining officers, and reassuring a public that felt stunned. Those memos, dry as they seem, marked the beginning of a long process of reassessment that would influence regional politics for years. Across the region, families confronted absence. Some simply did not know where relatives had gone. Letters returned unopened. Rumors spread that prisoners had been taken, that bodies were unidentified, that lists would soon be published. Women visited offices that smelled of ink and dust, submitting names that clerks dutifully copied into ledgers. These scenes lacked the drama often associated with war, yet they reveal the deepest cost, the transformation of a single person into a line in a book. The uncertainty lingered like a low ache. The religious dimension, too, deepened. Clerics of various traditions addressed congregations, reminding them of patience, of faith, of the long arc of history. Some interpreted events as divine tests, others as warnings. Pilgrims wondered whether they would ever again walk freely to sites that shaped their spiritual lives. Negotiations about access to shrines combined theology with security protocols and fragile diplomatic understandings. Even the keys to certain gates became symbols, their metal weight a reminder that control often reduces to very tangible objects. Historians later traced how institutions responded during these days. Schools temporarily adopted revised curricula, inserting new maps into geography lessons while quietly retaining older ones in storage. University libraries began collecting pamphlets, speeches, and leaflets, anticipating future scholarly demand. Archivists, thinking ahead, labeled boxes with neutral titles like regional developments to avoid premature conclusions. These decisions display the slow, methodical nature of preserving the past, an unheroic task that nonetheless ensures later generations can study what actually happened. Amid all of this, individual encounters left marks impossible to quantify. A soldier sharing a cigarette with a bewildered shopkeeper, a nurse translating between a frightened child and a stern officer, a farmer negotiating for permission to irrigate a field that now lay across an invisible administrative line. Such moments rarely enter textbooks, yet they accumulate, layer upon layer, influencing attitudes more powerfully than official proclamations. They reveal the complexity of occupation, retreat, and uneasy coexistence. Even nature played its quiet role. Summer heat worsened tempers. dust-clogged machinery, and lungs alike. In the evenings, as temperatures finally dipped, exhausted men and women sat on rooftops or along stoops, staring at horizons that seemed suddenly uncertain. Dogs barked at distant sounds. Lamps flickered. Conversations drifted to practical matters, harvests, school examinations, the price of flour, because speaking too directly about fear was sometimes harder than ignoring it. By the time international calls for a ceasefire grew louder, the shape of the post-war landscape had already begun to form in habits, not declarations. Checkpoints had routines. Households had contingency plans. Military units had established supply lines that hinted at permanence. Diplomats could negotiate terms, but it was the accumulation of small, repeated actions that hinted at the future. This realization unsettled many observers. Change had arrived without asking permission. And yet, despite the weight of all that had happened, there lingered a fragile sense that choices still mattered. Leaders debated whether to entrench or to bargain. Citizens wondered whether protest or patience would better protect their families. Soldiers considered how to behave in roles they had never expected to occupy. None of these questions had easy answers, and perhaps that is why the period feels, in retrospect, both decisive and unresolved. Looking back on this quiet, methodical stretch of the conflict, one is struck not by dramatic charges or fiery speeches, but by ledgers, supply crates, permits, and maps. The dull details turned out to be decisive. They shaped movement, constrained options, and gradually hardened temporary arrangements into enduring realities. If this was the moment when the war seemed to slow, it was also the moment when its consequences deepened, often invisibly, like roots spreading underground. And so we are left with a lingering thought. In a conflict remembered for its speed, perhaps the most consequential moments unfolded at a slower tempo in offices, kitchens, hospital wards, and quiet hillsides, raising a question that still echoes today. When history moves quickly on the surface but slowly underneath, which layer ultimately defines what comes next? The sense of pause that settled over the region did not bring clarity so much as a deeper complexity. Governments began to study the situation as if it were a puzzle whose pieces had been shuffled without warning. Newly gained territories, hastily established lines, and wary populations created an environment where every administrative choice carried strategic weight. Officials discovered that the simplest questions suddenly felt large. Who controls this road? Who has the authority to issue travel papers? Which rules should apply until something more permanent is agreed upon? In Israel, cabinet meetings stretched late into the night. Ministers passed folders across the table, each stuffed with reports from commanders, economists, and legal advisors. The tone was careful and restrained. Victory had changed the map, but not the underlying dilemma of insecurity. Some argued that retaining high ground and buffer zones was essential. Others warned that ruling over hundreds of thousands of people who had not chosen this outcome would carry moral and political costs that could outlast any battlefield advantage. The room smelled of coffee, fatigue, and the uneasy awareness that history had handed them both opportunity and burden. Across the Jordan River, leaders confronted a different reality. Towns that had once felt distant from the front now carried scars, broken walls, abandoned houses, families scattered across new lines. Administrators tried to restore schooling, reopen municipal offices, and maintain a semblance of normality, even while negotiating with authorities they had never expected to answer to. The work was procedural and exhausting. Receipts had to be printed. Records needed to be recopied because older documents now referred to boundaries that no longer existed. It was the kind of bureaucratic labor few remember, yet it shaped the way ordinary people experienced the aftermath. The United Nations became a focal point for hope and frustration. Delegates drafted resolutions that sought to translate battlefield realities into diplomatic formulas. They spoke in deliberate, measured language about withdrawal, secure borders, and mutual recognition. The text that eventually emerged, discussed, amended, and debated with almost legalistic obsession, became a framework for years of negotiations. Its cautious phrasing left room for interpretation, which was both a strength and a weakness. The words were clear enough to bind discussions, yet flexible enough to fuel disagreements that endured long after the ink dried. For soldiers still deployed, life began to resemble a long watch. Patrols followed predictable routes. Checkpoints opened and closed at appointed hours. The urgency of combat faded into routines that were both dull and tense. A guard might spend an entire night listening to the hum of insects, alert for an unpredictable sound. Mess halls served meals at regular intervals, and small rituals formed: the preferred seat at a rough wooden table, the habit of cleaning boots before sleep. These were not the dramatic images that appear in commemorative films, yet they defined the lived experience of occupation and border duty. Civilians adjusted in equally quiet ways. A shopkeeper in East Jerusalem learned to keep two sets of invoices, one for older suppliers, one for newer arrangements. A farmer near Gaza recorded watering schedules that depended not only on weather, but also on the timing of inspections. Families arranged code phrases over the phone to indicate whether the streets felt calm or tense that evening. Weddings and funerals continued, though guests often arrived later than planned after being delayed at gates. Life took on an improvisational quality, shaped as much by paperwork as by tradition. In Egypt, inquiry commissions began assembling timelines. Officers testified about missing messages, confused orders, and equipment that had never fully recovered from earlier conflicts. The tone of these hearings was subdued. There was less anger than weary recognition that institutions needed rebuilding from the inside. Military academies revised curricula. Training exercises emphasized coordination between air and ground units, and technicians were given greater authority to insist that machines be overhauled rather than patched. It was incremental work, often buried beneath layers of official secrecy, but it reflected a society preparing for the long term rather than reliving the shock of defeat. Syria, too, confronted the consequences on the Golan. Families displaced from their villages became part of a growing diaspora within their own country, moving into towns already under strain. Government officials promised eventual return, while simultaneously strengthening defensive positions along the new line. Engineers surveyed hillsides for bunkers. Roads were reinforced. The psychology of the frontier hardened, and the soft pastoral landscape acquired a military geometry: trenches, observation posts, and warning signs that transformed everyday paths into restricted zones. Religious leaders across communities interpreted the war's meaning with care. In synagogues, churches, and mosques, sermons touched on themes of humility, destiny, patience, and compassion. Some insisted that victory or loss should not become idols. Others warned against letting political triumph overshadow ethical restraint. Pilgrims who managed to visit contested holy sites did so with a mixture of gratitude and unease, aware that each step carried political implications. Keys, guardianship rights, and security arrangements became almost ceremonial instruments, representing centuries of layered claims. Meanwhile, scholars and analysts began collecting oral histories, sensing that memories would fade quickly. They interviewed farmers about daily routines under new administrations, teachers about changing textbooks, and soldiers about the moment when fear turned into numbness. Many interviewees spoke less about ideology and more about small, stubborn details: the taste of dust during a march, the sound of foreign language commands shouted across a checkpoint, the feeling of standing in line for documents whose purpose they barely understood. These fragments later helped historians reconstruct a more human portrait of the period. Economically, the region entered a complicated phase. Trade routes shifted, some markets shrank, others expanded. Israeli planners considered how to integrate new territories without deepening inequality. Arab states debated whether to pursue confrontation, diplomacy, or a policy that combined both. International aid organizations assessed needs with spreadsheets and field reports. They tracked commodities, flour, fuel, medical supplies in quantities that seemed mundane until shortages appeared. In the cold language of ledgers, one could trace the slow shaping of a new regional order. Children, perhaps, experienced the war most differently. For them, the conflict became a set of impressions rather than a narrative. A boy in a refugee camp remembered the sound of canvas tents snapping in the wind. A girl in a kibbutz recalled the strange sight of soldiers sharing dinner quietly in the communal hall. In classrooms, maps changed from one year to the next, and teachers sometimes hesitated before explaining why. Childhood games adapted, imaginary borders, invented checkpoints, and stories about heroism that echoed adult conversations without fully grasping their weight. Journalists returned months later to places they had hurried through during the fighting. They found villages with new fences, towns with rebuilt facades, and families who had learned to describe what happened with careful economy. Many reporters discovered that the story was no longer about rapid movement, but about slow adjustment. Their articles began to focus on the psychology of waiting for negotiations, waiting for news about missing relatives, waiting for an uncertain future that might arrive quietly, without fanfare. Academics debated the war in conferences and journals, arguing over whether it proved the superiority of preemptive strategy or simply revealed the vulnerability of states unprepared for coordinated attacks. Some emphasized the transformative role of air power. Others highlighted intelligence failures and misread intentions. Beneath these theoretical disputes lay a shared recognition that the conflict had redefined the relationships among the region's major players. Alliances shifted. Military doctrines evolved, and public expectations of security, dignity, and national purpose hardened into something less flexible. Among Palestinians, new political currents began to gather force. Displacement and occupation fostered conversations about agency, representation, and identity. Meetings held in cramped apartments or open courtyards discussed whether older approaches should give way to new ones. The language was tentative at first, more exploratory than assertive. But over time, these conversations would feed into movements that sought to speak in their own name rather than relying solely on neighboring states. The seeds of future activism were sown not in grand declarations, but in quiet evenings filled with debate and uncertainty. Israel, for its part, confronted the moral weight of holding territory filled with people whose aspirations did not align with its own. Courts heard petitions about land use, property rights, and freedom of movement. Newspapers published essays questioning how long the temporary situation could remain temporary. Religious nationalists saw providence. Secular liberals saw a dilemma. Many ordinary citizens felt both emotions at once. The conversation was often subdued, carried out in community meetings and university seminars, yet it gradually shaped the nation's political vocabulary. Internationally, the conflict altered how superpowers viewed the Middle East. Washington and Moscow reassessed their strategies, seeing the region not only as a geopolitical chessboard, but also as a laboratory where doctrines might succeed or fail with global implications. Military attachés requested detailed reports on equipment performance, communications, reliability, and troop morale. These assessments filtered into larger Cold War calculations, turning local realities into components of a broader rivalry that extended far beyond the region's deserts and cities. The memory of the war also took on symbolic lives within art and literature. Poets wrote about exile and unexpected victory. Novelists explored the inner landscapes of soldiers and refugees. Painters captured the stark lines of new barriers and the soft resilience of people who refused to disappear. These creative works, often overlooked by policymakers, preserved emotional truths that official histories sometimes miss. They reminded audiences that beneath statistics and maps lay human hearts wrestling with loss, pride, confusion, and hope. Over time, commemorations began. Parades marched in some cities, while moments of silence were observed in others. Monuments were erected, inscribed with names that families traced with trembling fingers. Museums assembled exhibits filled with uniforms, letters, and broken equipment. Each artifact was a quiet witness. Visitors moved slowly past display cases, absorbing stories that blended courage with tragedy. Memory became institutionalized, not merely a private feeling, but a public narrative open to continual revision. Yet for all the attempts to impose meaning, ambiguity persisted. Was the conflict an unavoidable collision of fears, or a failure of imagination? Did it create stability by altering borders, or did it freeze tensions into more dangerous shapes? These questions did not yield neat answers. They hovered in conversations like background music, shaping attitudes about negotiation, deterrence, and coexistence. What stands out, when we examine this period carefully, is how much depended on patient, unremarkable labor, the clerk copying records, the translator clarifying misunderstandings, the medic labeling bandages, the driver choosing a safer route. History often highlights commanders and diplomats, but the continuity of everyday life rested on countless individuals whose names rarely appear in textbooks. Their quiet persistence kept communities functioning through upheaval. As the months unfolded, the war's brevity seemed almost deceptive. It had lasted only a handful of days, yet its aftershocks extended into every corner of society. Children grew up within its shadow. New generations learned geography that older ones barely recognized. Laws changed, roads shifted, habits hardened. Even those who tried to ignore politics found that politics now shaped where they could travel, whom they could visit, and how they imagined the future. Standing at this point in the story, it becomes clear that the conflict was not a single event, but the beginning of a long, unresolved chapter. Decisions made in offices and barracks, in kitchens and council chambers, continued to ripple outward in ways no one could fully predict. And that leaves us with a quiet, lingering puzzle. If a war of mere days can transform decades, how do societies learn which choices from those tense hours deserve to be questioned and which must simply be lived with? By this point, the war's map had hardened into something that looked final on paper, yet felt provisional to nearly everyone living beneath it. The ceasefires, announced in formal language, did not instantly erase the tensions woven into roads, neighborhoods, and fields. Instead, the region slid into a state that felt neither fully war nor genuine peace, a limbo where small gestures carried heavy meaning and where ordinary errands could brush against geopolitics without warning. In Jerusalem, the question of custodianship over sacred sites demanded careful choreography. Religious authorities negotiated access with the same precision military planners had once applied to logistics. The opening and closing of gates became ritualized, watched by pilgrims, soldiers, and diplomats alike. Papers were signed, keys were exchanged, statements were issued that sounded bland. But beneath that blandness lay centuries of memory and grievance. Tour guides adjusted their scripts, unsure how to describe a landscape that seemed to have shifted beneath their feet while still appearing, stone by stone, unchanged. Across the Sinai, crews cleared wreckage along desolate highways. Twisted metal was dragged to the side of the road and catalogued with methodical patience. Engineers walked with clipboards, measuring distances, assessing which airstrips might be restored and which would simply return to sand. These mundane inspections were strangely quiet, interrupted only by the buzz of flies and the scratch of pens. Yet the results of those inspections would decide how easily new conflicts might flare or whether different forms of restraint could take root. Families in Gaza faced the layered realities of occupation, with a mixture of stoicism and improvisation. Permits became central to daily life. People learned which offices processed which documents, and which clerks might listen sympathetically if a form was incomplete. Mothers rehearsed explanations before stepping into administrative buildings, hoping that clear words might shorten long waits. Meanwhile, fishermen examined the sea with renewed caution, aware that invisible lines now determined where they could cast nets without risking confrontation. Survival meant knowing the rules and recognizing that the rules might quietly change. Israeli reservists rotated in and out of newly held territories, moving from city apartments to makeshift outposts and back again. Many spoke later about the psychological shift, the abrupt transition from civilian normality to the slow vigilance of checkpoints. Some brought books, cramming them into backpacks next to spare socks and canteens. Others kept journals, not out of literary ambition, but as a way to steady their thoughts. They wrote about encounters with locals, about moral discomfort, about boredom that was occasionally broken by sudden bursts of tension. These notebooks, seldom published, captured the ambiguous nature of maintaining control without clear end dates. Jordan continued to absorb waves of refugees who arrived with bundles of clothes, faded photographs, and stories that resisted neat summarizing. Aid workers registered names beneath flapping canvas tents. Doctors vaccinated children, keeping careful records in notebooks, prepared to transfer the data into more permanent ledgers later. Schools sprang up inside prefabricated buildings where chalkboards were salvaged from wherever possible. Lessons blended reading, writing, and a quiet attempt at reassurance. The hum of daily instruction became, in its own modest way, a strategy for survival. Egypt undertook a slow, sober reconstruction of military doctrine. Rather than celebrating bravado, training manuals emphasized coordination, redundancy, and practical realism. Commanders ordered more frequent radio drills. Workshops standardized spare parts inventories so that critical components would not disappear into bureaucratic limbo. Military academies studied foreign conflicts with a new humility, asking what had gone wrong and how failure could be transformed into discipline rather than despair. This process did not make headlines, but it realigned expectations across an entire institution. Syria fortified the Golan Line with a kind of grim determination. Survey teams marked slopes where artillery could be concealed. Bunkers were poured with reinforced concrete, their thick walls smelling of damp dust and fresh cement. Farmers displaced from hillside villages wrote letters to relatives describing orchards left untended and wells that might collapse without regular care. Those letters, filled with practical worries about land and trees, revealed how deeply rooted attachment to place could be and how displacement reshaped identity as much as territory. International donors and economists studied the region through the lens of development. They spoke of infrastructure, growth projections, and humanitarian corridors, as though these technical terms could soften the sharp edges of politics. Meetings produced reports bound in neat folders. Charts traced trends over months and years, pointing to potential opportunities and looming crises. While these documents lacked drama, they became essential references for officials trying to prevent fragile communities from tipping into deeper instability. Within Palestinian society, an increasingly articulate conversation emerged about self-representation. Students gathered in dormitory rooms to discuss history, law, and strategy. Older activists debated whether diplomacy, resistance, or cultural preservation offered the most durable path forward. Small presses printed pamphlets that circulated quietly, sometimes hand-delivered to avoid scrutiny. The tone was thoughtful rather than fiery, shaped by people who had lived the consequences of earlier decisions and were determined to think more carefully about the next ones. Israeli intellectuals also grappled with questions that refused to fade. Philosophers, jurists, and writers published essays examining the tension between security and ethics. Was it possible, they asked, to maintain territorial control without eroding democratic ideals? Could victory undermine the very values it was ostensibly meant to protect? These debates did not produce consensus, but they kept a spirit of introspection alive at a moment when triumph could easily have drowned out doubt. Quiet stories of resilience continued to ripple through households on every side. A grandmother in a refugee camp insisted on teaching children traditional songs so that language would not fray. A young Israeli nurse learned enough Arabic phrases to comfort frightened patients more effectively. A Syrian engineer, now displaced, volunteered to repair generators in a crowded shelter because he could not bear to sit idle. Such actions were small, almost invisible in official records, yet they stitched moral fabric where political structures had begun to tear. Meanwhile, archaeologists worried about sites newly exposed to uncontrolled access. Trenches sometimes cut too near ancient ruins. Soldiers sheltered in caves whose walls bore inscriptions older than any modern nation-state. International committees quietly negotiated protections, reminding commanders that beneath these contested landscapes lay histories shared by all humanity. Few civilians heard about these meetings, but they mattered an attempt to ensure that the deepest layers of the past would not be lost in the disputes of the present. Artists responded as well. Painters captured stark horizons with thin, pale strokes, hinting at both beauty and desolation. Musicians composed pieces that moved slowly, like mournful marches interrupted by sudden crescendos. Theatre troupes staged modest productions in community centres, exploring themes of exile, duty, and memory through intimate dialogue. None of this changed policies, yet it preserved emotional truth, giving people language to describe experiences they had struggled to articulate. Gradually, the region settled into what some analysts called a managed tension. Barriers stood, patrols continued, negotiations flickered on and off like unreliable lamps. And yet, within this uneasy equilibrium, life did not cease. Harvests still had to be gathered. Children still had exams. Markets opened, closed, and opened again. The persistence of daily life, patient, repetitive, sometimes numbing, proved to be its own quiet form of resistance. Years later, scholars would look back at this period and argue that the seeds of later developments, political movements, peace initiatives, uprisings, and renewed conflicts were planted here, in the careful paperwork, the measured sermons, the long nights of debate, and the routines of occupation. It was not the loud moments alone that shaped the future, but the grey hours in between, where people chose patience, resignation, or quiet insistence in ways that gradually accumulated into history. And so this section closes on an unsettled thought. If the truly decisive forces were not only battles, but also the quiet systems built afterward, how many of those systems were created intentionally, and how many emerged simply because no one knew how, or dared, to imagine something different? Decades later, much of what once felt urgent has faded into archives and commemorations. Maps that were once redrawn with trembling hands now hang behind glass, their disputed lines explained in small print by patient curators. Veterans visit museums and point out places where the captions feel incomplete. Former refugees walk past exhibits quietly, recognizing whole lifetimes condensed into a paragraph. History has a habit of compressing pain into tidy labels, and yet the echoes linger in ways labels cannot contain. Children born long after the fighting grew up among memorials they did not choose. They memorized dates for school exams, then went home to grandparents who told stories that contradicted the textbooks in subtle ways. In those contradictions, the children learned something essential: that truth is rarely singular, and that memory carries its own politics. Some reacted by turning inward, tired of arguments that seemed older than they were. Others became determined researchers, convinced that careful study might finally unknot what force had failed to settle. The land itself kept its own record. Olive trees resumed their patient cycles of budding and harvest, though some groves were smaller, others newly planted. Desert winds erased old tire tracks and filled abandoned trenches. Hills scarred by fortifications softened with grass. From a distance, it might have appeared that time had healed everything. Up close, broken stones and unmarked graves reminded the attentive that healing and forgetting are not the same. Diplomats came and went. Agreements were signed, revised, broken, revived. Each generation of negotiators believed they were closer than the last to a solution that would hold. Each discovered how fragile compromises can be when layered over unresolved loss. Still, they kept returning to the table, perhaps out of hope, perhaps out of exhaustion, perhaps because the alternative had proven itself too often. Writers and filmmakers transformed the era into narrative. Some works celebrated resilience, others mourned what had been lost. A few dared to dwell in ambiguity, resisting the easy comfort of heroes and villains. Audiences argued afterward, not only about politics, but about responsibility, empathy, and the ethics of remembering. The conversation itself, contested, unfinished, became another legacy of the conflict. And in university libraries, historians continued their quiet labor. They compared diaries with dispatches, declassified cables with oral histories. What emerged was not a single verdict, but a layered portrait of human decisions made under pressure, improvisations, misjudgments, flashes of courage, moments of fear that hardened into policy. The more closely they looked, the less inevitable the past appeared. This recognition, unsettling as it was, carried a strange kind of hope. If history had not been preordained, the future might not be either. Near the end of his life, one of those historians addressed a small audience at a community center. He spoke without theatricality, summarizing years of study into a simple observation. Wars, he said, are often remembered by the dates when they begin and end. But societies are shaped by the quieter intervals that follow the rules people accept, the wounds they acknowledge or ignore, the stories they choose to tell their children. Power redraws borders quickly, meaning redraws them slowly. The room was quiet when he finished. Outside, traffic murmured, and a breeze rustled the leaves of a tree planted years earlier during a ceremony few people now recalled. Life, as always, went on neither triumphant nor defeated, but persistent.